Hi, everyone. My name is Tim Angus. I'm the CEO of a company called BrickGuy. We're a Canadian-based IoT software company, and like a lot of Canadian companies, we derive the majority of our revenue here in the United States. We're really focused on capturing and analyzing critical live construction data, mostly in infrastructure construction, as well as luxury high-rise development, which is a very fast-growing market here in the US, particularly South Florida, Texas. We have over 300 major infrastructure builders and developers that are using our platform today, and we've got about a 95% reorder rate from them. We're currently raising our Series B round, focused on getting 10 to 15 million. So if you're a corporate venture capital or strategic interested in anything related to infrastructure, construction, or insurtech, we'd love to talk to you. But what I'm really here to do is introduce the next session. Very pleased to introduce two people to the stage. Going to be discussing the structural forces in a more contested world. So please welcome George Hoyam and Mike Collins.
Okay, who's hangry out there? Okay, all right, we'll be swift here, but wanted to thank Mike for joining us. I'm George Hoyam. I manage the investment team at In-Q-Tel. The strategic investment arm of the U.S. intelligence community is the way we describe ourselves. We have the pleasure of introducing Mike Collins, who his position is kind of a long name, so I'll see if I get it right. He's the acting chair of the National Intelligence Council at the Office of the Directorate of National Intelligence. And that's an umbrella organization that sits over all of the IC, the intelligence community, CIA, NSA, et cetera, and it was created after 9/11, which Mike may delve into. He also served before that as the Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific Mission Center, and he was the Chief Strategy Officer at the Central Intelligence Agency during some pretty interesting times. So we're going to get into a lot of this in the background, and Mike's going to chat with us about some strategic global shifts that are underway. But first, Mike, give us a short history of your journey from the CIA to the DNI, the Director of National Intelligence, and what relevance that may have for this group of corporate venture capital investors. And feel free to describe acronyms like DNI and other ones you may use.
Well, thanks, George, and thanks for the invitation. And to everybody for a chance to speak. At a higher level, I'm obviously going to connect sort of the macro geopolitical issues we're tracking in the world with what hopefully you all understand and you work on a day-to-day basis at a more techno-economic sort of level. Thanks as well to you and In-Q-Tel for what you and the team there do and help us in the intelligence community, not just to build and acquire technology we need, but also to understand from the practitioners what they're doing in that domain. And congratulations, everybody here. May sound a bit Pollyannish, but what you're doing, this model you represent, and as you've heard from the DNI in her testimony on the Hill itself, the intersections between techno-economic innovation and geopolitical security in the world has never been tighter, and increasingly so. My bottom line up front as a career analyst is nevermore is what you're doing at a macro level more foundational to U.S. national security and transnational security, that is the things we need for the global commons, and at the same time more under threat, more contested by authoritarians in the world who want a different model for how we put money toward technological investments, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I'm the head of the National Intelligence Council, which is the umbrella for the U.S. intelligence community's analysis of all the events and issues in the world, supporting the Director of National Intelligence, who is the senior advisor to the President of the United States on all intelligence matters.
And there's not much going on right now.
There's a lot, yeah, right. It's been a busy week. Just got finished helping the director prep for her testimonies on the Hill just this last few days.
Related to that startup company? Well, not quite.
Related in part, yes. So
we'll talk about that.
We handle the day-to-day, all the intel that goes into and the intelligence assessments that goes to the policy meetings, the longer-term national intelligence estimates, those of which we often publicize publicly in our transparency web, and of course the global trends and the representation of all of our analysis, including in the ATA. Let me say 3 formative events that have helped me to think in my transition from my role as an analyst to where I am now that come to mind in this intersection between the techno-economic innovation and geopolitical security. The first was my position as Deputy Assistant Director for China, East Asia at CIA, where I helped to implement the agency-wide strategy for how we think competitively about the PRC, but all the more coming to appreciate the competition itself is in fact increasingly a systemic one. It's about systems, it's about not just political systems, about economic systems and et cetera, and appreciating the intersections that come across those. At the same time, COVID. I was the deputy assistant director during COVID, and never more were we on the front lines and not only figuring out this metastasizing crisis that was happening in the world on our front lines, but increasingly the intersections between truth, the truth behind the crisis, the doctor in Wuhan who was trying to tell the truth over the vaccines, et cetera, et cetera. Second, as Chief Strategy Officer for CIA, I led the reviews that put together the Technology and Transnational Mission Center, the stand-up of the Chief Technology Officer and the China Mission Center. But at the same time, put in place for the first time the representation of intelligence itself in the national security strategy of the United States. Intelligence as an asset in and of itself, not just military, economic, or diplomatic, or political power, but are we more intelligent, literally, than our adversaries in a competitive way? And then last, my journey here to the NIC, working for the DNI, all the more appreciating the intersections between traditional national security and the things that we also worry about in the transnational domain, climate, et cetera, human security, basic science, getting back to the COVID pandemic. And then last, she is quite a strong advocate of all the more intersecting with the private sector. And I'm going to speak to that more. The intelligence community's role in interacting with the private sector.
Wow. Okay. So this charter that you have, my understanding is part of it is to focus on private sector partnerships and the influence of non-state actors on exposing truth in closed societies, which is a mouthful. But in that context, how does that relate to this group? And can we talk about TikTok, which seems at the sort of pointy edge of that spear, if you may?
Yeah, let me get back to the TikTok at the very end, but at a broader level, this world that we're analyzing, as I said, increasingly the connections between economics, science, technology, innovation, and geopolitics. The world is fragmenting more at a strategic level between the United States and our partners and what our adversaries, China and its partners, stand together with at a geopolitical level. It's also the norms that have driven long-standing U.S. and frankly economic success in the world have never been more challenged because of the great power competition, but for other reasons as well. And the norms that govern how you innovate, how you move capital, how you do so in a freely transparent way are also being contested relative to another model. And most importantly, this is what worries me most, is the increased prevalence of misinformation and disinformation, or lack of intelligence, literally defined, in the world. As a longstanding political scientist and IR person, it troubles me, not just the increased prevalence of and how easy it is to metastasize lies and false truths around the world exponentially more quickly than something truthful in media, but even more so, almost a disregard for the importance of the truth relative to the fact. And I would just ask every one of you here who invest in technology, et cetera, do you ever invest in something that you know is a lie? Do you ever invest in something that's falsely advertised? And that's increasingly where we need in a relationship with the private sector, all the more so. Understanding the world, the private sector increasingly matters. The private sector more so than ever before, because of technology in particular, but not just because of technology, is influencing global events like never before. And you all know all the examples, and you're part of that. You are the non-state actor domain. They, at the same time, is where innovation is happening. We in the US government are not going to innovate on our own. In-Q-Tel is a great example of why we need ambassadors to help us innovate in the things we need. Third point, because of 1 and 2, it is also greatly under threat by our rivals and by our authoritarian competitors around the world. They want your IP, they want to influence, they want to affect this. It's our job as the intelligence community to actually think more broadly about what we do to protect, including private sector, techno-economic leadership.
And what are your thoughts on TikTok?
So TikTok is an example.
Yeah, I know you were trying to dodge that question.
I mean, as an example, so in the information domain, objectively, the norms that govern information as we understand it, the privacy, the legal protections, the independence of our courts, the rule of law, freedom of press, there's a lot of power that comes from that in ensuring that the information that we all receive is the strongest and most transparent as it can be. We should worry about organizations, entities that could otherwise be influenced by a foreign actor who thinks 180 degrees differently than we do on norms governing free press, independent judiciary, rule of law, and has in place national security laws that will dictate and require entities to in fact support them if the Communist Party of China really requires it. So not just specific to this event, I think what it speaks to more broadly is what we've been talking about, more of a latent threat. A threat that can come uniquely from some entity because of who has influence over it and the nature of who is influencing it, right? There's a difference between entities like this who are influenced by authoritarian governments and entities like this who otherwise could be influenced by other regimes in the world who also govern themselves the way we do as well, freedom of press, independent judiciary, rule of law, et cetera. So,
Thank you for that. And by the way, we're actively investing in things to understand the provenance of truth, so we'll keep doing that. So you talked earlier about greater power competition, and based on those titanic shifts, many of the people in this room who have global corporations are facing the prospect of decoupled economies and the center of activity, you know, where we have supply chains that are decoupled. Like, how should they think about that? And what are your views from a national security perspective? Are we moving towards decoupling, or is there some other pathway?
I think this speaks to the sort of the larger point that I'm trying to reinforce, the intersection increasingly between the geopolitical dynamics in the world and where it's trending and the techno-economic. And speaking just to how we analyze and assess, and the director spoke to this in her testimony just this week, how the Communist Party of China is doubling down on a model to dominate its technology. It doesn't want to depend on others' technology. There's a reason why the government of China, more specifically, the Communist Party of China under this particular leader, Xi Jinping, cannot depend on the technology of somebody else to oversee and regulate how they want to regulate their own domestic polity. This is not just, as we often talk about the threats in the world, what it is the Communist Party of China is trying to accomplish globally. It's what it's trying to all the more double down on domestically, controlling its people, controlling its society, controlling its economy. And in ways right now that we're seeing that belie what other smart economists would say is actually needed for China's economy. So it's an area where I encourage everybody here to think more seriously about trends that are taking place, not because necessarily the United States is bringing it about alone, just because of our policies. For good national security reasons, some of the policies we're putting in place, as I spoke to earlier about the threats we see, but because we have an authoritarian rival in the form of China who's actively trying to create a system, a construct that is regulated and drives technology differently.
So one of the things that impacts this group a lot is many of the investors here are from around the world. And in the last 5 years, we've seen the enhancement of the CFIUS regime. We passed FIRMA, and there's ITAR, export control things that are getting a little bit more tight. And this group often has to do disclosures and various things. Where's that trending? Is it working? And have we accomplished what we wanted to with that, or are we slowing things down? But what's your perspective from a national security viewpoint? Is CFIUS and all FIRMA and all that working?
I think the activity alone is really, really important, and increasingly so, as we need to, from a national security standpoint, stay ahead of threats that come from the intersections between our economies and those of others who are trying to erode U.S. leadership in the world. Let me be very clear, though, as well, in what I'm articulating. I'm not talking about Chinese people, Chinese citizens, China itself as the threat. It's what increasingly the Communist Party of China and the leadership of China is trying to encourage, and the controls they're trying to put over what used to be increasingly hard to say there's a private sector that's free of the state's influence in China, and how they're trying to use that to acquire our innovation, acquire our technology, or acquire our talent, and to influence dynamics in the United States. So CFIUS is a good example of where, in an objective, transparent way, and with regulations put on top of it, and with our courts overseeing the things we put in place, we're doing so in a more objective way to ensure we're protecting those intersections and protecting ourselves against vulnerabilities from those intersections.
Thank you. So at In-Q-Tel, we think about the traditional definition of national security has historically been something related to kinetic intelligence capabilities, guns and missiles and all that stuff. And sort of referring a little bit earlier to your comment, We've heard you talk about the importance more broadly and deeply about the impact of transnational issues like climate change, artificial intelligence, Gen AI, et cetera. So we're curious, and I'm curious, are we reframing the definition of national security, and how do those issues relate to the future of how we think about national security?
We're trying to. As one of the reasons why I was, and others were, supportive of putting the word intelligence in the national security strategy as I just articulated it, was because we do see it in a more competitive way. We should appreciate it in a competitive manner. But at the same time, we also need better intelligence, better science, better technology, better engineering to solve hard global commons issues. And these are not mutually exclusive. That if we're successful in the intelligence that we're building and benefiting from the technology that is being developed in the private sector, to the point I made earlier, we'll stay ahead strategically in a great power competition, but at the same time we'll solve hard problems that we need to solve, including climate change, et cetera. We, not alone. I think what I'm saying, when I use the word we, I increasingly use a broader definition of we. As the head of the National Intelligence Council, my national intelligence officers who work for me know their job function is to husband together the best of perspective from everywhere to answer hard questions for the policymaker, not based purely on what we can do. But partnership, increasingly so, between the U.S. intelligence community and the private sector is an increasing priority for us.
So as an example, I know we're almost out of time here, but as an example of new emerging large techno trends, we think about non-terrestrial networks, Starlink, and other satellites, Astronus being launched, et cetera, and there's from non-state actors, and we're being able to share and get information off these networks, and it's expanding the canvas of where we need regulatory regimes, et cetera, and there are companies that operate these things. How does that change the way national security thinks about commercial capabilities like that, and do we want to harness it? Is it a threat? Is it an opportunity?
I think as with AI, in terms of AI's potential, broadly speaking, to help U.S. intelligence, and I'm a firm believer that in fact there is tremendous potential. I know a lot of people talk a lot about the concerns that come from it, and I don't mean to understate the concerns. But this is where you all in your world, and you're investing in the right technology, the mitigations for some of the concerns that could come from AI matter increasingly so. This too is another domain where it's moving in that direction. The better we are in helping to support and enable leadership in it, the better for U.S. national security, as opposed to regimes that otherwise, as I said earlier, could be influenced in an untoward way by authoritarians who think differently about how to govern the world.
And I have a bonus question, which wasn't on here, but it just came to mind. Hopefully it's okay, but last question. So in that you have these exotic ways of collecting information and intercepting signals, and people run around talking to people. But there's the domain of open source, which is the domain of Twitter, it's public data, it's ChatGPT. Like, if we look at the signal that national security is getting out of open source content, stuff that's available to everybody, but through these tools is being curated and understood, versus the exotic proprietary information you have, how does that weight these days? Like, do you get a lot from open source, or is most of it still the old, shoe leather way of getting information?
So increasingly we are. Part of the reason is because of some of the issues I discussed that we are prioritizing more to analyze the state of influence in the world, the trajectory of narratives that matter increasingly in the world, to the point I said about disinformation. That answer is in the open domain, to actually see how our rivals are manipulating and surveilling their people in their social media is an example of something I can openly observe that is hardcore for national security. But at the same time, we're always going to have a need, of course, for investing in technology that allows us to do our job that we need to secretly in those areas for which secrets are really, really important. But increasingly, as I said earlier about being part of that open conversation, even before AI, I was often asked the question of the Bellingcats in the world and open source domain. Are you afraid of that? Because somebody's going to prove that open source could answer the question instead of what you can answer with classified information. My response is that's fantastic, because it all the more proves the point I'm saying. If open truth is on the table and true investigative journalism, investigative science is what's being prioritized, we win. as opposed to those who depend on false truth, lies, et cetera. So if we're not in that domain in tapping into and leveraging that, and at the same time trying to speak more openly and objectively to challenge lies in the world, and only trying to hide in that classified inbox, I don't think we're satisfying our national security requirements, and increasingly so a broader definition of national security that increasingly includes the techno-economic, scientific innovation community that you all represent.
Great. Over time. Thank you, Mike, for your time. He's going to be around the rest of the afternoon if anybody wants to catch up with him. Thank you.
Thanks, Joyce.